Before starting the video, I would like you to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. The werewolf, also known as a lycanthrope or werewolf, is a legendary creature present in many cultures independently, since throughout the world it is said that this is the most universal of all myths, probably along with that of the vampire. Even today, many people believe in the existence of werewolves or other kinds of beastmen. That is why, today I will tell you anecdotes experienced by subscribers who claim to have seen werewolves. Without further ado, turn off the small light in your room and prepare for terror. This is Underworld. The Werewolf, horror story based on a true anecdote. February 1967. The jump that the cart made when passing over a stone woke me up. My brother Javier was sitting, resting his back on the wood that divided the load from the seat where our father was driving. It took us 2 hours to get from the sugarcane field to the village. The three of us were exhausted after the hottest day of the year. My father's voice ordering the horse pulling the cart to stop made me and my brother stand up. We turned our heads to see what was happening. A homeless-looking man was walking with difficulty at the side of the road. "My name is Rogelio Chavez. I'm from Argentina," he explained. "Far from telling you a credible story, tonight I will leave you stupefied with my experience. Because, believe it or not, what is sometimes considered a legend can come to life in some inhospitable place in the world." With a tired look and torn clothes, that strange boy stopped to observe my father while he asked him where he was going. He seemed lost in himself. Exhaustion marked his face with signs of having been walking for hours. He barely managed to say good night before falling silent. We helped him onto the cart, and the wheels began to move again. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and the orange horizon was painting the hills. Night was approaching. The boy, exhausted, gave up and fell asleep at our feet. My brother and I watched him indiscreetly, trying to let him take the rest that his body was asking for. The smelly perspiration had soaked his clothes, and the sweat had drawn perfect streaks of dirt on his face. He had clearly not washed for days. 30 minutes later, the darkness had dissipated the last ray of light and, almost simultaneously, the clouds cleared, giving way to the glow of an immense full moon. What for us was a simple peasant began to undergo a metamorphosis that no sane mind could imagine. With small muscular tremors, a pestilent vapor began to leave his body. Under our amazement, that boy began to convulse until the shocks woke him up. He barely opened his eyes when he screamed at the sight of the huge moon above him. Like a madman, out of control, he sat up and jumped out of the cart, perhaps wanting to escape. The fright caused by his actions stopped the horses, who were neighing uncontrollably. The three of us hurriedly got down to attend to the young man, who kept screaming and shaking on the ground. But we took a step back when, from his voice, a howl arose that echoed throughout nature. My senses were blocked when I heard the cracking of his bones. His shoulders began to widen, as did each of his limbs. The skin took on a black color, which seconds later turned into thick hairs growing all over his body. What we saw was a being that defied all logic. Claws grew instead of nails, and his mouth elongated to form a snout from which he kept howling. His ears, eyes, and hands transformed, resembling those of a humanoid wolf. His precarious clothes were torn and fell in pieces to the ground. My brother, overcome by panic, fell to his seat. I could barely move my arms, which I instinctively used to cover myself. A sublime terror paralyzed our souls. In less than a minute, the being had taken on an appearance just like the character that until then we believed existed only in myths. My wide eyes met his gaze, which seemed to come from hell itself. My heart was beating fast, and I felt death near when I saw him stand on his hind legs and fix his eyes on us. That hairy demon was no longer screaming. Now he was howling, subdued by his bestial side. He made a gesture to approach, raising one of his claws as if he were going to attack us. However, there was still some humanity left in him, because he stopped his intentions when, behind us, my father cursed him, pointing his rifle at him. Silence and uncertainty accompanied us in the following seconds. He took a few steps back, and, with hoarse growls, he seemed to try to communicate something to us that we never understood. After that, he turned around and ran away on all fours, saving our lives that night. At dawn, The news that a werewolf had roamed the countryside shook everyone. No one knew who it was, only we saw it in both its natures. From then on, we spent months trying not to find it. But, just in case, we all loaded our guns with silver bullets, which, thank God, we never needed to use, since that werewolf never returned. Good night, Underworld. My name is Miguel Ortiz. I am from Michoacán, Mexico. Next, I will tell you a story shared by my grandfather, who was an eyewitness to the events. He was 20 years old at that time, in the 1970s. He lived on a ranch, about 30 minutes from the town on horseback, and there were hardly any inhabitants in that place. On the ranch there was a small cantina, which he used to go to when his parents were not there. On one such occasion, he headed to the bar, where he hoped to meet his friends for another night of drinking. However, that night, an unknown old man joined the group. Dressed as a charro and well-mannered, he introduced himself as a passing traveler, and his horse, which remained with the others, was notable for the scars on its brown leather, signs of attacks by some animal with sharp claws. This detail caught everyone's attention. The hours passed between laughter and beers, until the stranger began to behave inappropriately when he was denied more drinks because he could not pay. Neither my grandfather nor his friends agreed to give him more, so he left the bar threatening everyone present. When closing time came, around 11, the others left and my grandfather, being the only one who lived near the ranch, had to start the return trip alone. Under the light of the full moon, which barely illuminated the dirt road, his horse began to act nervously. He tried to calm it down, but he could only advance a little further before something appeared in front of him. The blow was so abrupt that it knocked him to the ground. When he got up, he noticed red eyes watching him from the shadows, accompanied by a growl that silenced all the fauna of the mountain. An abominable creature, resembling a wolf standing on two legs, emerged from its hiding place, its body covered in dark fur and protruding fangs. It howled furiously, as if celebrating an upcoming banquet. Frightened, my grandfather managed to climb onto the horse, which, with all its strength, began to run in a desperate attempt to escape. However, his hopes vanished when he saw the creature running beside him. At every step, the creature swiped at him and growled furiously. In the midst of this race for its life, my grandfather begged God that its death would not be painful. The horse, exhausted, began to slow down until it finally stopped. Realizing what was happening, my grandfather hugged the animal's neck in a last attempt to save himself. Then he noticed something horrible. A long open cut in the horse's belly left its intestines exposed, torn by the creature's claws during the chase. Bewildered, he searched for the creature, which watched him with its red eyes, salivating and emitting a final roar so loud that it left him hearingless for a few moments. Surprisingly, the beast decided to let him live, slowly moving away into the darkness. My grandfather believes to this day that the creature was the same stranger from the cantina. Like him, others also suffered the visit of that being, but not all were so lucky. Some tried to confront it and, the next day, they woke up lifeless, dismembered, with their weapons still in their hands. That encounter left my grandfather scarred for life. He never returned to the cantina on the ranch and avoided going out at night. Years passed, but he could never forget those red eyes and the way that being tormented him, playing on his desperation. In the town, the story of that night spread like wildfire. Soon, other inhabitants began to speak of similar experiences. A man who changed his form at dusk, a wandering charro who transformed into a hellish creature. No one knew his true name or origin, but they said he carried with him a curse, and that those who shared his table and drink could suffer a fate worse than death. It was said that the stranger had made a pact with the devil, thus gaining the ability to turn into a werewolf. No one could confirm this, but the mystery only increased when, weeks later, they found a horse in the region with the same scars and a trail of blood that disappeared into the thick forest. My grandfather always said that he survived thanks to his faith, which gave him strength in those critical moments. He said that even when he got to the ranch he couldn't sleep. He spent the night awake, with the sound of the last growl still echoing in his ears. After that incident, his friends at the cantina also began to notice strange things. Some said they had seen shadows on the roads back to town. Others felt they were being followed. although when they turned around they didn't find anyone. Every generation in the family has heard this story, and although some think it's an exaggeration, I have seen how my grandfather's voice breaks every time he remembers that night. His eyes reflect the fear he lived through, and he always warns. If one day you find a lonely Charo in a cantina and his horse has claw marks, avoid his gaze and don't share your drink with him. Or you could find yourself trapped in a nightmare that has no end. Over time, the legend of the Charo Lobo spread beyond the ranch, reaching neighboring towns and becoming a recurring tale during campfire nights. The creature was said to be a kind of dark guardian, wandering in search of wandering souls who, due to their lack of caution or their defiant spirit, dared to challenge its presence. Some witnesses claim to have heard its howls in the distance, especially on full moon nights, when the darkness and silence seem deeper. Others claim to have seen huge footprints on the ground, a mix of hooves and claws, as if they were from an animal trapped between two worlds. As the years passed, the stories became more vague, but the fear did not diminish. For my grandfather, however, the story never lost intensity. In his later years, he insisted that that night was a warning. He said that the Charo Lobo only appeared to those who needed to remember something essential, although he himself could not explain what that experience had really taught him. The only thing that seemed clear to him was that he had been lucky to survive. After his death, my family found an old rosary among his belongings, one he had carried with him since that night in the cantina. The rosary was worn, as if it had been tightly squeezed over and over again. For him, it had become his only shield, and he always carried it, no matter if it was day or night. Even though my grandfather is gone, the story remains. On nights when the moon shines full and the darkness seems alive, I remember his words and feel a chill run through my skin. Perhaps, somewhere in Michoacan, the Charo Lobo is still lurking, waiting for someone else to cross his path. And I, as he warned me, avoid lonely roads and strange cantinas, because, deep down, I know that some legends are too alive to ignore. With each generation, the story of the Charo Lobo was transformed, taking on new and dark details. Some said the werewolf was no mere stranger, but a damned soul, a man who in life had made a dark pact, selling his soul in exchange for power and fortune. Others believed he was a Nawal, a sorcerer with the ability to transform into a beast to punish those who strayed from the values and traditions of the people. Even though many years had passed since that night when my grandfather encountered the Charo Lobo, the fear never completely faded in our family. Even now, when I share this story, I feel a kind of obligation to warn those who hear it. It is almost as if the weight of this story has been bequeathed to us to remember that, in those forgotten corners of Mexico, there still exists a blurred border between the world of the living and that of the spirits. Sometimes, at family gatherings, someone takes up the legend and tells us new stories of similar encounters. Hunters, day laborers, and occasional travelers say they have seen a figure wearing a sombrero and Charo attire prowling the roads, especially near old cantinas. Rumor has it that when someone sees him, the Charo wolf is friendly at first, but if he feels challenged, his eyes glow bright red and the shadow of his sombrero becomes the prelude to a night that many do not overcome. The inhabitants of the region, even the youngest, prefer to avoid walking alone at night. It is said that the Charo figure does not appear by chance. He chooses those who cross the line, who lose respect for the mystery of the night and the secrets of the land. Some even leave him offerings of flowers or tobacco in deserted places, hoping to win his favor or, at least, his indifference. Today, when I hear the howling of dogs at night or feel the cold wind on my skin, I can't help but remember this story. Because, although my grandfather is no longer here and times have changed, the wolf Charo is still there, keeping his terrible secret and stalking, perhaps, those who have the bad fortune of crossing paths with him. Hello, how are you? Good evening. I am 71 years old. I am from Guanajuato, Guanajuato. What I am going to tell happened in my childhood, when I lived with my father on a ranch surrounded by fields. I think it was around 2 in the morning on a Thursday when my mother woke my brothers and me up. Between sobs and fright, we asked her what was happening, but she only asked us to keep quiet. As I passed through the living room, I saw my father with an uncle, with some weapons, spying towards the window. They took us to a back room and, before closing the door, we heard those petrifying howls. My mother covered her mouth with her hands to contain her crying. She hugged us and tried to calm us down, saying that nothing would happen to us. But I, being 10 years old and older than my brothers, knew what it was about. It was not the first time I heard it. The howls were getting closer and closer. He was coming, or perhaps I should call him that thing. I put my hand on my mother's face and asked her to stop crying, assuring her that we would come out unscathed once again. But she told me no, that this time was not like the last. Now his hunger was beyond his understanding, and he was ready to commit a massacre. A shot warned us that he was here. My father's screams, asking the cursed being to get away from the ranch, mixed with the slow shots that echoed in my ears. Screams, half man and half animal, claimed territory, as if we were the intruders. When the shots became more continuous, a familiar stupor raised the hairs of those of us who were cornered in our own house. Everything was silent for a moment, until a powerful scratch made the wooden walls of the room where we were hiding tremble. My mother called my father, thinking only of our well-being. He arrived and fired into a corner of the room, repeating that he would take the life of that beast without mercy. Immediately afterward, the glass of one of the windows in the living room broke. From there, my father and my uncle shot, but they seemed to miss. Another series of explosions preceded the violent knocking down of the door, and then everything was silent. At that moment, I knew. The beast had been wounded. I could not hold back my tears and, breaking free from my mother's arms, I ran to the living room shouting for them to please stop shooting at it. There was that thing lying on the floor, bleeding and dying. My father and my uncle remained absorbed, looking at it. I approached the beast and, kneeling beside it, threw myself on its bloody body. I cried inconsolably as I saw its eyes fixed on mine. I understood its language. It asked me for forgiveness. Its heartbeat, which at first was accelerated, slowed down until a last sigh was directed towards me. As every time I broke into the house, this time all its suffering ended. The nauseating fur on its body fell off and its human features began to quickly regain their shape. That old man that it kept inside became visible again. His heart stopped beating, with his gaze fixed on mine and a smile on his face, that smile of innocence that I loved so much. That was how my grandfather lost his life at the hands of his own children. He was never guilty of anything. In any case, we should hate the full moon, which was the true culprit of all evil. She was the one who turned my beloved grandfather into a werewolf, stealing his conscience and transforming him into a terrifying beast. Good evening, Underworld. My name is Gustavo Ojeda. A few years ago, I retired from the police force, where I served most of my life. What I am going to tell you is real. I lived it. I saw it with my own eyes when one night in 1997, it changed my perception of the world that I thought I knew completely. Patrolling with my partner, we were notified by radio of an alleged kidnapping. They had just received a report from a woman who identified herself as a domestic worker. A mother lived in the house with her teenage son and, according to the worker, sometimes the mother locked the boy in a room, tying him tightly to a chair until the next day. The perplexity of the case disoriented us. We could not imagine a mother doing that to her own son. The employee, already aware of the situation, was threatened by the woman not to report it. But finally she dared to tell us because that night she was planning to lock him up again. We went to the house, a large house surrounded by high bars. It was already after 8 in the evening, and the sky, which had been cloudy before, was clearing up, revealing a beautiful full moon. We knocked on the door for a long time, but were not answered. With some tools, we managed to break the lock. The neighbors, seeing us, came over to tell us that sometimes they heard the screams of a young man inside the house. Stealthily, we crossed the garden and reached the door. A scream for help was heard from inside. We broke a window and quickly entered. The screams came from a room with a reinforced door, so we put all our effort into breaking it down while the screams lost intensity. When we opened it, we went down a staircase to a room similar to a basement. There, we encountered the most horrifying sight of our lives. A lifeless woman lay on the floor in a pool of blood, completely destroyed. Next to her, a monstrous-looking creature, a werewolf, literally, was devouring her flesh. With disgust and bewilderment, we shot, causing it to release the victim's body. The beast destroyed the wall, making a hole through which it escaped. In the center of the room was a chair with broken ropes. We understood that the woman had not managed to tie it in time. That same night, the creature was found in the forest and hunted by some shamans of the town, who claimed that only by using blessed bullets could they kill it. There were several of us who saw that beast transform into a young man after dying. He was the woman's son. I leave it up to you to decide the veracity of this story. I do not need your approval. It is enough to live with this macabre memory in my mind every day. What do you think of these terrifying stories based on real events sent by you, the public? I look forward to your opinion in the comments. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe, like and share. For now, I'll say goodbye, but not before wishing you sweet nightmares. Good night, and until next time.